At 5:12 local time, the northern Arabian Sea looked almost perfectly calm. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in soft blue light as the early morning sun began to rise. From a distance, the massive silhouette of the aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, moved steadily through the open ocean at about 18 knots. At more than 100,000 tons, the Ford is the largest and most technologically advanced warship ever built. To an observer miles away, it might appear almost motionless, an island of steel quietly cutting through the water. But beneath the calm surface of the sea, the entire carrier strike group was already operating like a synchronized machine. On the flight deck, deck crews walked between parked FA-18 Super Hornet fighters, preparing the first patrol launches of the day. Bright yellow vests signaled aircraft handlers guiding equipment into position. Nearby, maintenance crews inspected weapons mounts and fuel lines. Below the deck, inside the Combat Information Center, the real heartbeat of the ship was already fully active. Radar screens glowed across the dark operations room. Green sweeps rotated slowly across the displays, painting the surrounding ocean with hundreds of sensor returns. Commercial cargo ships, distant fishing vessels, and merchant traffic moving along international shipping lanes. Everything looked routine. Then suddenly, one radar console registered a new contact. Bearing 041 degrees, range 28 nautical miles. The operator leaned closer to the screen. Seconds later, a second contact appeared behind the first, then a third. 3 surface vessels, tight formation, moving directly toward the strike group. Inside the room, no one raised their voice. They didn't need to, because every sailor in that room understood something immediately. Out here in international waters, approaching a U.S. carrier strike group was never accidental, and the situation was about to become far more serious. At 5:14, the radar picture inside the Combat Information Center sharpened as new data streams began updating every few seconds. The 3 unidentified vessels continued advancing across the digital map, their formation tightening as they approached the outer edge of the carrier strike group's defensive screen. Automatic identification systems attempted to cross-reference their hull signatures. Seconds later, the answer appeared on the display: Iranian Navy surface combatants. Inside the operations room, the watch team remained calm. Encounters like this were not unheard of in the region. Iranian patrol ships occasionally shadowed U.S. naval forces operating in international waters. Most of the time, those encounters ended with little more than radio warnings and careful maneuvering. But this situation began to feel different. The radar operator noticed the first unusual change: speed increase. The 3 ships accelerated from 16 knots to 21 knots, then 24 knots. Instead of spreading apart as most patrol vessels would do, the ships moved closer together, forming a tight triangular formation while maintaining a direct heading toward the carrier strike group. The officer of the watch immediately ordered the standard maritime response. A radio message transmitted across open channels: Iranian naval vessels approaching United States carrier strike group. This is a U.S. Navy warship operating in international waters. Alter course immediately and maintain a safe distance. The message echoed across the ocean. No reply. The radar display updated again. Speed 27 knots. Now the ships were clearly operating at intercept speed. Inside the electronic warfare console, another signal suddenly appeared on the spectrum display. A thin line of static cutting across the screen. One of the Iranian ships had activated its surface search radar. Moments later, the signal intensified. Then came a second, far more focused radar mission. The technician leaned forward. Fire control radar detected. That single phrase changed the tone of the room instantly. Search radar meant observation. Fire control radar meant targeting. And the range counter was still dropping. Distance 19 nautical miles. The carrier strike group was now being actively tracked. At 5:16, the tension inside the Combat Information Center reached a new level. The radar operators were no longer simply tracking approaching ships. Now they were watching the electronic spectrum closely, analyzing every signal coming from the 3 Iranian vessels. Then the infrared sensors suddenly registered something unusual. A sharp burst of heat, then another, and a third. The technician immediately recognized the pattern. Missile tubes opening. Before anyone could say another word, 3 intense flashes appeared on the infrared display, brief but unmistakable. Rocket motors ignited almost simultaneously on the decks of the Iranian ships. A half second later, the radar confirmed it. 3 fast-moving objects had just lifted from the surface. Their flight paths appeared as thin red vectors cutting across the tactical display. Vampires inbound. The warning spread instantly across the carrier strike group's tactical network. 3 anti-ship missiles flying low and fast. Altitude roughly 30 feet above the ocean surface. Speed just under Mach 1. This was a classic sea-skimming attack profile, designed to hide inside the radar clutter created by ocean waves and reduce the defender's reaction time. Inside the CIC, the intercept computers began calculating engagement solutions automatically. Time to impact, 90 seconds. But the aircraft carrier was not alone. 8 miles ahead of the formation, one of the escorting destroyers, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, shifted instantly from patrol posture to full defensive engagement mode. Within seconds, the ship's Aegis combat system locked onto the incoming threats. Deep inside the destroyer's hull, vertical launch system hatches began sliding open. Moments later, 2 interceptors roared into the sky. Standard missile 2 interceptors streaked upward in pillars of flame before rolling forward toward the incoming targets. For the sailors watching from the carrier's bridge, the calm morning sky suddenly filled with missile contrails. The first interception was about to begin. At 5:19, the 3 incoming missile tracks raced across the radar screens inside the Combat Information Center. Thin red vectors cut across the digital ocean map, closing rapidly on the carrier strike group. The intercept timeline was already counting down. Range 14 nautical miles, time to impact, less than 90 seconds. But the fleet's defensive network was already in motion. 8 miles ahead of the carrier, the guided missile destroyer USS Arleigh Burke had locked onto the incoming threats using the powerful sensors of the Aegis combat system. Inside its vertical launch system, 2 interceptors ignited. The missiles erupted from the deck in towering columns of flame before climbing sharply into the morning sky. For a brief moment, they traveled almost vertically, then rolled forward and accelerated toward the incoming Iranian missiles. The intercept geometry closed rapidly. Inside CIC, a radar operator called out the countdown. 5, 4, 3, then the radar screen flashed. A bright burst of static bloomed over the ocean. The first Iranian missile disappeared. Intercept confirmed. But 2 more remained. Those surviving missiles adjusted their flight path automatically, dropping even lower over the water, just meters above the waves, to avoid detection. Range 8 miles. Now the strike group's second defensive layer activated. Another escorting destroyer, USS Mason, locked its radar onto the 2 remaining targets. Moments later, 2 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, ESSM, launched in rapid succession, streaking toward the sea-skimming threats. Seconds later, another explosion flashed across the radar display. 1 more missile destroyed, but the final track remained. Now the numbers were changing fast. Range 4 miles, time to impact 15 seconds. At that distance, the last line of defense belonged to the carrier itself. Mounted above the superstructure of USS Gerald R. Ford, the Phalanx close-in weapon system swiveled toward the incoming threat. The 6-barrel 20mm Gatling gun spun to life with a mechanical whine. Target lock. Then the gun opened fire. A roaring stream of tracer rounds tore across the water. For half a second, the missile continued forward. Then it vanished in a violent burst of flame. Less than 1,000 yards from the carrier's bow, the first missile salvo had been completely destroyed, but the radar picture was already updating again. Because the 3 Iranian warships were still closing, and new heat signatures were appearing on their decks, another volley was coming. At 5:21, the radar picture changed again. Even before the smoke from the first intercept had fully drifted away, 3 new missile signatures appeared on the tactical display. Another volley. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard USS Gerald R. Ford, alarms sounded again as the system marked 3 new sea-skimming tracks, racing toward the strike group. Range, 16 nautical miles. Time to impact, just over 1 minute. But this time, the fleet had already learned something important. High above the carrier strike group, 2 FA-18 Super Hornet fighters were circling in a routine combat air patrol. As the warning call came across the radio, Vampires inbound. Their radar screens lit up with the 3 incoming missile tracks. Then something unusual appeared behind them, a small airborne contact. Higher altitude, slower speed. The radar operators aboard the E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft analyzed the signal first. Possible targeting drone. The discovery immediately changed the tactical picture. The drone was flying several thousand feet above the missiles. acting as a mid-course guidance relay. From that vantage point, it could track the carrier's radar signature and transmit course corrections to the incoming weapons. Without it, the missiles would lose precision. The lead Super Hornet pilot immediately rolled his jet toward the contact, pushing the throttle forward as the aircraft accelerated past 500 knots. Distance closed rapidly. Inside the cockpit, the targeting box locked onto the small aircraft. Weapon selected, AIM-120AM or AAM. The pilot squeezed the trigger. Fox 3. The missile ignited and streaked skyward. Seconds later, the radar return vanished in a bright flash. The Iranian drone exploded high above the sea, and instantly the incoming missile tracks below began to drift. The second attack had just lost its eyes. With the Iranian targeting drone destroyed, the three incoming missiles immediately began to lose stability. Without real-time guidance updates, their flight paths started drifting slightly above the waves. But even a drifting missile flying at nearly Mach 1 was still extremely dangerous. Inside the Combat Information Center, the defensive network responded instantly. The destroyer USS Mason locked its radar onto the two closest tracks. Seconds later, two Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles launched from the ship's vertical launch system, streaking low across the sea. Within moments, the first Iranian missile vanished in a bright explosion roughly 6 miles from the carrier. The second disappeared seconds later. Only one missile remained. Now it was flying erratically, weaving slightly left and right as its seeker struggled to reacquire the massive radar signature of USS Gerald R. Ford. High above the water, the wingman flying the second FA-18 Super Hornet spotted the streak of the missile below. "I've got visual." He pushed the jet down to just 200 feet above the ocean, closing the distance rapidly. Inside the cockpit, the missile's hot exhaust plume lit up the infrared targeting display. Weapon selected, Sidewinder. The tone sounded in his headset as the seeker locked onto the target. The pilot fired. The AIM-9X Sidewinder leapt forward and struck the missile seconds later, detonating it in a flash directly above the water. The second Iranian missile wave had been completely destroyed. Inside the carrier's command network, the captain's voice came through clearly. "Neutralize the launch platforms." For the first time in the engagement, the mission shifted. The fleet was no longer defending. Now it was preparing to strike back. At 5:25, the tactical picture inside the Combat Information Center had changed completely. The two missile waves had been intercepted, but the three Iranian warships were still moving aggressively toward the carrier strike group. Their speed remained above 30 knots, and heat signatures on their decks confirmed that their missile launchers were still active. This time, the response would be different. High above the ocean, the two FA-18 Super Hornet pilots rolled their aircraft into a steep descent toward the targets. Their radar screens quickly painted 3 distinct surface contacts cutting through the water. Range 12 miles. Inside the cockpit of the lead fighter, the targeting box locked onto the first ship. Weapon selected, a GM-84 Harpoon. The pilot steadied the aircraft at 300 feet above the ocean, then pressed the trigger. Fox. The Harpoon missile dropped from the wing and ignited instantly, racing forward just 20 feet above the water in a classic sea-skimming profile. Seconds later, a second Harpoon launched from the wingman's aircraft. Both missiles streaked toward the Iranian formation before the ships could react. The first impact came fast. The missile slammed into the lead warship just above the waterline, erupting into a massive fireball that tore through the ship's internal compartments. Thick smoke poured into the sky as flames spread across the deck. 3 seconds later, the second Harpoon struck the second vessel near its missile launcher. The explosion ignited stored fuel and munitions, ripping apart the rear section of the ship in a violent blast. The third Iranian vessel attempted to turn away, accelerating hard in a desperate attempt to escape. But it was already too late. Moments later, a missile launched from the destroyer USS Mason struck the fleeing ship, disabling it in a final explosion that sent a column of black smoke rising over the sea. Within minutes, all 3 hostile vessels had stopped moving. The threat was over. High above the ocean, the Super Hornet circled once more before turning back toward the carrier. On the flight deck of USS Gerald R. Ford, crews prepared to recover the returning fighters. There were no cheers when the jets landed, only quiet professionalism. Because for the sailors of a carrier strike group, the lesson was clear. An aircraft carrier never fights alone. It fights as part of a network of ships, aircraft, sensors, and crews working together as one system. And when that system is tested, it responds. If you enjoyed this breakdown of modern naval warfare, Be sure to watch our next video and stay informed about the technologies shaping today's battlefield.